Welcome, everyone. We're excited to have you join Registrar Corp for Blueprint for FDA Food Safety, Essential Plans and Programs. I'm proud to introduce Fabiola Negron, Registrar Corp's Director of Food Safety, who will be leading this webinar. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Industrial Microbiology and graduate course work in Food Science and Technology from the University of Puerto Rico. Since joining Registrar Corp in 2016, her team has reviewed and developed over 2,000 food safety plans across HACCP, Food Defense, FSVP, etc. for FDA compliance. Throughout this webinar, feel free to write any questions in the Q&A box, and we've saved time at the end to answer them. We'll also follow up with a link to the recording so you can refer back to this at any time. Without any further ado, Fabiola, take it away.
Thank you so much. Our agenda for today includes going over the food safety regulations for food facilities, our plan or program components, the applicability of these requirements to the different industries and exemptions, then qualifications that are required to implement or develop these plans that we will be discussing, then preliminary steps for development and common observations from the FDA, as well as from our experience with assisting our clients all throughout these years. Then we will move forward into the Q&A section as my colleague Alexis explained. So before we start, I'm so excited to present this webinar number 2 of our 4-part series on the essential plans and programs. This is my personal favorite topic, so I'm very excited to share all the tips and tricks with you today. I'd like to talk first about what Registrar Corp does, and it is likely that we have assisted some of you already by registering your facility, reviewing your food safety plans or labels, or maybe helped you with a petition for removal from import alert. And Registrar Corp is the global leader in FDA regulatory compliance. For over 20 years, we have helped companies in the food supplement, cosmetic, drug, and medical device industries with FDA requirements. We have assisted over 30,000 clients across 190 countries, and we have about 20 offices worldwide to provide support in your respective time zones and languages. And we offer services and software solutions to address your needs with a high rating of client satisfaction. Our specialists are highly qualified and experienced to give you adequate advice and help you navigate the complexity of the FDA requirements and help you achieve compliance. We are also ISO 27001 certified to ensure that all the data and the information that you share with us is protected. So we thank you for joining us today and for choosing us as your trusted FDA compliance resource. So moving on to our plans and programs, we will be discussing these main plans and programs that are required by the FDA for food facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods. These are the Food Safety Plan, Supply Chain Program, Recall Plan, HACCP Plan, and Food Defense Plan. So you will likely need to develop and implement one or more of these in your facility unless an exemption applies. I will be describing each of these components to which facilities and activities the requirements apply to and the qualifications needed to develop and implement them. So we will start off with the Preventive Controls Rule. This rule came into force as part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, and the facilities have been required to comply with these requirements since 2016 now, so 8 years. We have 2 main rules under the preventive controls, and these are 21 CFR 117 that applies to human foods and 21 CFR 507 for animal foods. These regulations apply to facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods intended for humans or animals, respectively. And the main requirements include writing a food safety plan, a supply chain program, and a recall plan. These plans must be developed and implemented by a preventive controls qualified individual. And later on, we will go on to explain what a PCQI is. So as we mentioned, there might be some exemptions to these rules, and they are based on certain financial criteria. So if you meet the requirements for a very small business or qualified facility, you may be exempt from developing a food safety plan, supply chain program, and recall plan. So first, you have to determine your eligibility by calculating and considering the following. You must calculate your annual sales and market value of the food, manufacture, process, factor held. That includes unsold inventory held for a fee. And know that food for human is calculated separately from food for animals. So if you handle both, then you must conduct separate calculations. You must consider the sales and market value globally, not just the food that you send to the United States or distribute throughout the United States. You must include sold to other countries or locally as well. You must consider your entire business operations pertaining to food, including any subsidiaries and affiliates. And you must calculate the average of the annual sales and market value of the previous 3 years. For example, if you were performing calculations now, you must consider the financials for years 2023, 2022, and 2021. The cutoff date for these calculations is every December 31st. So when December 31st comes at the end of this year, then you will calculate those averages considering 2024, 2023, and 2022. So once you have those totals, you must also adjust that total for inflation. The FDA has published a guidance that is shared here in the column number 3, and this helps industry determine their eligibility for these exemptions and provides examples of how to conduct those calculations and what documentation or invoices, tax information to consider. The FDA website also has a resource updated yearly to provide the inflation per year numbers. So we typically recommend our clients to discuss with their accountants or their finance department to make sure that they are considering the proper documentation and all the numbers that may apply so that the calculations are done correctly. So when you obtain your totals and averages, if you are below the 1 million US dollars for human foods or less than 2.5 million for animal foods, you will be eligible for the exemptions. So being eligible is not enough. You must then submit a qualified facility attestation to the FDA. They have that form on their website, and there you provide the details of your operation. You attest your control measures that you're applying to the food, and you also attach your financial calculations and the evidence that you meet that financial criteria. The FDA will review that and then will provide you in an email, confirming whether your status has been granted. And if you do not submit this attestation, you will be required to comply with the full requirements, even if you are a very small business. So it's very important to follow these steps, because if you are eligible for these exemptions, you should take advantage of them. So starting with food safety plans components, these are the primary documents in a preventive controls food safety system that provides a systematic approach to identifying food safety hazards that have to be controlled to prevent or minimize the likelihood of foodborne illness or injury. Food safety plans are developed by product category, so you can group products that have similar characteristics and processing steps. Do not try to group different categories and processes together, as it can become confusing to follow and can result in an inadequate plan. So we've seen this in many instances where different product categories are grouped or tried to be crammed into just one main document, and then it's difficult to identify which processing steps apply to which products, and it can become very overwhelming to understand which controls apply to which food. This can also result in missed potential hazards when you are conducting your hazard analysis. So going into the hazard analysis, this is required to be written, and it is to identify potential biological, chemical, and physical hazards and assess the likelihood and the severity of the hazards to determine if they require a preventive control. The preventive controls are then the measures that you will apply to minimize or prevent the hazards that you have identified as significant. If they're likely to occur and severe, then you must identify these preventive controls. There are 4 types of preventive controls, and these are the process preventive controls, which are equivalent to the CCPs in a HACCP system. So process preventive controls. Allergen preventive controls, which are used to address undeclared allergens and the potential of allergen cross contact. Sanitation preventive controls, which help you prevent cross contamination of ready to eat foods and allergen cross contact. Then lastly, there are supply chain preventive controls for the controls that can only be applied by your supplier or other entities prior to receiving at your facility. So this means that the hazard will not be controlled in your process or by any other subsequent entities in the supply chain. Most of the preventive controls are required to have monitoring, verification, and corrective actions. Certain process controls will also require validation. The monitoring procedures establish which parameters need to be reached and how they will be checked to ensure that the hazards are controlled. And when you monitor preventive controls, you will also need to check that the control measure is working as intended through verification activities. This can include additional sampling and testing of the product for different parameters like pH or microbiological or chemical testing as appropriate to the control measure that you're applying. And validation is when you have confirmed that these parameters established are being effective. The control measures determined achieve repeatable results to ensure food safety. And as we mentioned, not every preventive control will require validation. One of these is sanitation preventive controls. A food safety plan then has to be reanalyzed at least every 3 years. So this is not a one and done. It is, once you do your food safety plan, there might be cases where there are changes to the formulation, there are changes to the processing steps or parameters, or changes in equipment, or the packaging of the product changes. So these changes then will require you to look back to your food safety plan and see if any of these changes impact the plan or impact food safety. So then you can make additional changes to the hazard analysis, or maybe it requires a new preventive control, or maybe you need to get rid of a previous preventive control measure. So it's important that these plans are kept updated and that with changes, your food safety leader then revises those plans as necessary to make sure that they are adequate. As part of the preventive controls, we also need to have a supply chain program when a hazard needs to be controlled prior to receiving the food from your supplier or a supplier, because then there are no control measures that can or will be applied as subsequent steps in your process or by other entities. So the supply chain program are procedures for approving and verifying that your suppliers are controlling the significant hazards for which there are no subsequent controls. The supply chain program must be considering supplier and categories. So you can group similar products like in the previous plan, but you must consider each supplier's practices separately. So you will understand why as we discuss the components below. You will need to conduct a hazard analysis of the raw materials or ingredients, and this ties in with the hazard analysis that is conducted for the process in the food safety plan. Because controls applied at processing steps will impact or determine if a supply chain control is needed. You must know who are the entities controlling the hazards. So supply chains, we know they can be very complex and sometimes a bit of a mystery as the products can pass through many entities prior to reaching your facility. However, the FDA requires that you know where your product is coming from and who is controlling the significant hazards. You could source a product from a vendor, for example, but that entity is simply selling the product or moving product along the supply chain. That entity might not be the one handling the product nor applying the controls. So it is crucial that you identify who is controlling the hazards so the evaluation and the verification of the right entity can be conducted and any food safety issues can be resolved promptly. Documentation and supply chain transparency are key. So once you have identified the entity responsible for controlling a hazard, you must evaluate their food safety practices and control measures that they are applying to ensure that they align with the preventive controls, other FDA requirements, and the hazards are properly controlled. This is why the supply chain program is per supplier, in addition to considering the category. You can receive the same category of product from different suppliers, but then some of them have very good practices and that ensure food safety, and others may have gaps in their food safety system that then can put your product at risk. So it's important to evaluate separately. So when control measures are applied by the supplier, you can determine the proper verification activities. And these can include sampling and testing of the product, review of food safety records, and or annual on-site audits. Annual on-site audits are the default verification activity when a SACOTA hazard or a serious adverse health consequence or death to human or animals is possible with the significant risk. So it's important that also when you choose on-site audits that the scope of the audit verifies the type of food and process that you are evaluating, and you must evaluate to ensure that the audit covers the appropriate control measures. That's also a little gap that we've seen when audit reports are collected. They tend to become more of a checklist. Oh, I have the document, it's good. They had an audit, but then we noticed that the scope of the audit maybe was for low acid canned foods, but then they are receiving a dried spices. So it has nothing to do with the product that they're actually that they're receiving. So it's important that you review that and analyze the audit reports thoroughly. So as part of the food safety plan, then the supply chain program also requires a reanalysis at least every 3 years. And the same applies where if there are changes to your supply chain, changes to the supplier's controls, changes in formulation, changes in anything impacting your analysis, then communication with that supplier is important so that you are made aware of the change and then you can change your supply chain program. A recall plan is also considered part of the food safety plan, and it is required when a significant hazard requiring a preventive control is identified. This is the set of documents with procedures, roles, and responsibilities for investigating, deciding, and carrying out a recall. The recall plan has to be written step by step, and these steps must include a detailed description with instructions. In addition to the instructions, it must be predetermined who is responsible for carrying out those steps. At the time of a recall event is not the time to try to have a meeting and figure out who is doing what. A recall event is a time to execute that plan and move as fast as possible. The more you take to recall a product, the more harm it can cause, right, to your customers or your business, the consumers. So you must have procedures and templates for communicating recalls for example, to the direct consignees, the authorities like FDA, and the general public, if applicable. You must have the pertinent information at hand to give clear instructions for identifying the affected food, like having lot numbers, what to do with the product, will they dispose of the food or return it, contact for asking questions, and other critical information. You should also have ways of communicating to ensure they have received the message. So via email, via physical mail, phone, try multiple communication methods to ensure that the message is received. And document all communication in writing for your records. After you've notified the consignees, you will periodically conduct effectiveness checks. And these are to verify that the recall is being carried out successfully. You can track the different stages of the recall to document the progress, who has acknowledged your notification, the percentage of retrieval of the product, and other parameters. Also determine where you need to follow up on communications and take further actions. You must have instructions of what you will do once the product is retrieved or received at your facility. It needs to be segregated and accounted for. You must know how you will dispose of it. Will it be reworked or does it need to be destroyed? So, depending on the situation, the FDA or other authorities may require the destruction under their supervision or in a specific manner. So, it's important to be aware of those requirements. A recall plan also has the same 3-year reanalysis requirement as it is part of the food safety plan, and you must reanalyze when changes impact the recall plan components. To give an example, these can include changes to your systems, traceability softwares, for example. If you no longer control significant hazards, then you might not need a food safety plan. Changes in the roles of responsibilities within the organization. Maybe a position that was in charge of a component of the recall plan is no longer a position in your organization. Therefore, there's a gap there. You need to fill that with somebody else. So it's important that the team in charge of recalls is communicating effectively and is tracking those changes within your systems, products, and organization to be sure that there are no gaps. Also, something that we recommend is to conduct a mock recall. So once you have finalized your recall plan, it's important to try it out, make a drill, or carry out a drill. That way you can identify what information or steps might be missing in your recall plan, how quickly the recall exercise was executed, because again, time is of the essence when there is a recall event. So the quicker that you communicate to your supply chain and within your business, the faster you can retrieve your product and prevent it from being distributed further. Now we're moving on to HACCP requirements. And HACCP, in terms of FDA requirements, applies to facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold seafood or 100% juice. Enforcement of the seafood HACCP began in the mid-90s, and for juice, it began in the early 2000s. The main requirement includes writing and implementing a HACCP plan. And these plans are developed and implemented by a HACCP trained individual. It is crucial to know that seafood and juice HACCP are not equivalent to other general HACCP systems or approaches. So the FDA has specific requirements and guidance for industry to follow and understand these specific requirements. And we will go into more detail about also the qualifications of that HACCP trained individual later on. Different to the food safety plans, there are no exemptions for very small businesses for seafood and juice HACCP requirements. So the HACCP plans, like the food safety plans, are developed per product category as well. You can group products that are similar in characteristics and similar with processing steps. And you must also develop a written hazard analysis to identify the potential biological, chemical, and physical hazards and assess the likelihood and severity of the hazards. This is a pretty standard requirement. But instead of identifying preventive controls, HACCP focuses on critical control points. And these are equivalent, as we said before, to the process preventive controls in a food safety plan. In a HACCP system, when sanitation controls are critical to food safety, they are addressed through sanitation standard operating procedures or SSOPs. So CCPs are required to include monitoring, verification, and corrective actions, and they must be validated. The monitoring procedures list the activities and the frequency with which they are to be performed for each of the critical control points. And this is to ensure that the critical limits that have been established were achieved. And when monitoring CCPs, you will also need to check that the control measure is working as intended through verification as well. Validation is when you have confirmed that the parameters established are effective and repeatable, and the effectiveness of the plan needs to be validated as well. A HACCP plan must be reassessed at least annually and whenever changes impacting the plan and food safety occur. So different to the preventive controls food safety plan, which is 3 years, the HACCP plans must be reassessed every year. Now, moving on to the intentional adulteration rule, this is also a requirement that came about with FSMA, and it is found in 21 CFR 121, and it is most commonly known as food defense requirements. It applies to facilities that manufacture, process, or pack human foods. It does not apply to food for animals. And it also applies to facilities that store, but store liquids in tanks. So if you're only storing product that is sealed and packaged in, and it is not a liquid in tanks, then you are exempt from having a food defense plan because that food is already protected. The main requirements are to develop and implement a food defense plan, and it must be developed by a food defense qualified individual. Same as the food safety plan exemptions, same calculations need to be made in terms of the food defense exemptions for human foods. So you're only considering human foods, and if those calculations are less than 10 million US dollars, then you will be exempt from writing a food defense plan. Oh, and in the case of the food defense plans, you do not need to submit an attestation. What you need to do is keep those financial records on file, and when FDA inspects you, then you can demonstrate your status as being, exempt from these requirements. They will review that there. So a food defense plan are the set of written documents that, based upon food defense principles, and incorporate a vulnerability assessment, which includes the mitigation strategies and delineates the food defense monitoring, corrective action, and verification procedures to be followed. There are facility-wide measures that need to be considered, and these are the general non-targeted practices to protect personnel, property, or the product just facility-wide. These are general measures that you can apply. Some examples include installing security cameras, screening employees or contractors before they are hired, restricting visitors from the food handling or storage areas, updating access control systems, having a plan for reporting suspicious activity, having fences or lighting in particular areas of your operation. So those are examples of general measures. And it's important to know that these general measures could become a mitigation strategy when conducting your vulnerability assessment. It just depends on what you need and determine. A vulnerability assessment is the equivalent of a hazard analysis for a food safety plan or HACCP plan. So it's the comparable component. However, in food defense, we are focusing on intentional adulteration of the food. In a food safety plan or HACCP, we are considering unintentional hazards that are either natural to the product or that may happen during processing if proper controls are not in place. But we are not contaminating the product on purpose when we're evaluating for food safety plan. So in this case, you evaluate each step point in the food operation to identify where the risk is for an attacker to access the food and contaminate it. So when an attack is likely or access to the food is likely, then that step becomes an actionable process step. For every actionable process step, then there needs to be a mitigation strategy or a combination of mitigation strategies. And these are the control measures that you will apply to restrict access or reduce the likelihood for an attacker to contaminate a food. And there are two main types of mitigation strategies, and these are the ones applied to minimize access or to reduce the ability of the attacker to contaminate the food. Within these two main types, there are subcategories of mitigation strategies, and these are personnel and operation based or technology assisted mitigation strategies. And these mitigation strategies must be monitored to ensure that they are being followed and are effective. For each mitigation strategy, these moved on. For each mitigation strategy, you must also identify corrective actions. And again, these are the steps to be taken when you find that a mitigation strategy has not been effective. And then you also have to reanalyze at least every 3 years or when there are changes in the activities conducted at the facility, when there is new information about potential vulnerabilities, or when you find that the plan is not being effective. So that brings us to our next slide of who is qualified to write these plans and programs. And the FDA defines qualified individuals as the persons who have the education, training, or experience, or a combination of these three to execute the food safety plan or the HACCP plan or the food defense plan. So depending on which plans you are developing, you are required to have specialized qualifications or training experience relevant to that activity. So under education, for example, these are examples. You don't have to have these to be a qualified individual, but it's the most common or more relevant type of education for these types of roles. So, for example, degrees in sciences like microbiology, chemistry, animal science, food technology, food safety, quality. So, anything related to that is typically a strong foundation for developing or having the expertise to develop these plans. Then, in terms of training, FDA has recognized standard curriculums under preventive controls, uh, for human foods and also for animal foods. Then we have the intentional adulteration training for the food defense plans. And in terms of seafood HACCP or juice HACCP, pardon me one moment, please. I apologize for the interruption. For seafood HACCP and juice HACCP, there's also specific training. So like we mentioned earlier, HACCP in general terms is a globally recognized system, but the FDA has very particular requirements that apply to seafood or juice according to the regulations. And then in terms of experience, you have to consider the years and the roles that you have or that qualified individual has been in. For example, roles in food processing, in food safety, food quality, quality assurance. So these are typical roles that give you the proper qualifications. So it's important to understand that because we've had cases where somebody can come like, oh yeah, I'm a qualified individual. I've worked 20 years in this facility, but then the roles that they have executed in that facility are not relevant to or can help them with the complexity of the food safety plans or the food defense plans. So it's important that you know you you have a combination of these. That's the strongest foundation for you to be confident that your plans that are being developed and implemented are appropriate. Then, in terms of the development of the plans, there are certain preliminary steps to developing. So, it's important that first you have a designated team, like a food safety team for both food safety plan or HACCP, that applies. And that you designate the leader who is going to lead that team to ensure that everybody does their part and that they have the education, training, and experience to bring all the information together, be able to assess it adequately, and develop a plan that is effective and ensures food safety. Another preliminary step is that we must understand the product. What is the product? And it's not sufficient to say it is ice cream and then you just do a hazard analysis for ice cream. No, it's like ice cream, and then what are the ingredients of that product? What is the intended use? What am I going to add on? What preventive control measures do I need? So it's important that you understand the product fully to then assess that into when you start developing the plan itself. Same applies with the process flow diagram. Sometimes having too general or a lot of processes grouped together, that can make it difficult to write a plan or a hazard analysis that makes sense. So it is important that the process flow diagram has all the steps from receiving of the raw materials down to to storage of the finished goods, and that you are as detailed as you can in determining what is a separate step. Now we have both sides of the spectrum where a plan could be too general or it can be too detailed. And with the too detailed, it can be that they are including steps prior to that are not relevant to processing. For example, finance makes a decision, or it's something that can happen behind the scenes, but it doesn't necessarily affect the process in a significant way or in terms of food safety. So it's important that the steps are clear and are complete, but that they are part of the processing. And then you consider also your product's history. So the history of that product in terms of recalls or your own facility's history in terms of contamination. What issues have you had across the years? So this is just preliminary information that you are compiling so that you have it all have compiled all the relevant components to begin to develop an adequate plan. With supply chain program, you will identify the raw materials requiring a supply chain control when you're doing the process hazard analysis. So that's why we mentioned earlier that these two plans work together, because if you identify a hazard requiring a supply chain control in your hazard analysis for the food safety plan, that means that you must have that hazard controlled in your supply chain program. Again, describing the product, describing the raw material that you are receiving is important to understand its characteristics and be able to identify the proper hazards. Then you consider your supplier's process flow diagram. How do they process that product? What control measures do they need to apply? What are their controls? What are their practices? Are these good practices that result in a safe product? Are the controls that they identified adequate for that raw material? You have to evaluate that. And then you also consider your supplier's history. This is a supplier that, every 2 months I have a positive salmonella result. That's a red flag. So you have to understand then, uh, if what are the gaps in their system, and you can only use approved suppliers. So it's important that if you're having recurring problems with a supplier, then you take further action to either replace them or make sure that they resolve the problems. So, to go into a little bit more detail about what to consider when developing the hazard analysis, we mentioned biological, chemical, and physical hazards. That is the general scope, right, of the hazard analysis. But when we are identifying those hazards, we have to understand the food. So, where did the food come from? What are the characteristics, intrinsic and extrinsic, of that product? Intended use and consumers. Are there high risk populations that will be consuming that food, like the elderly, infants, children, pregnant women? Those are things to consider when determining what hazards are significant. Also, processing steps and the equipment used. The processing steps, are they manual? Are they automated? Do they require the employees to manipulate the product? So that's important things to know. Also, the packaging materials and the internal atmosphere of the package. So is it a vacuum packed product? Is it reduced oxygen? Is it modified atmosphere? So those, the ambient of that package can also require additional controls, or make a new hazard possible. With packaging, is it glass? Do I need to worry about breakage of glass in my process? And then are there specific storage requirements needed for safety? Does my food require freezing, or does my food require refrigeration to keep it safe? And the safety history of that product and or the supplier. So is my product one that has been an import alert, or that has been responsible for multiple outbreaks? Right now, we get a lot of outbreaks related to produce, so I have to consider that in my hazard analysis. Or something like black pepper that has been associated with salmonella. So it's important to understand the history of your product, but also worldwide. Is this product a typically a concern for food safety? And then you incorporate that into your analysis. So with our preliminary steps for recalls, also designate a team and a recall leader. And this might be different from the PCQI. Recall is a different scope. So you might have different persons assigned to this team, and you designate responsibilities. You assign those steps. You must designate the responsibilities. The responsibilities may include people from the warehouse. It could include people from quality, from processing, people from even marketing, because they are the ones that are likely going to develop the materials that are going to go out to the public, and communicate to in websites or in the news. So it's important to have persons from the different departments come together for a recall event. Then you consider the product types. Maybe the different product types can require different types of actions. So it's important that you consider that. And also your product supply chain. Who are you selling that product to? What's the step forward and the step backwards, so that you communicate with the proper persons. For example, you might have a product that you received from someone else, you developed your own product, then sold it forward, and discovered that your product had salmonella. It might be that it was in your process, but it could have been an ingredient that you received from your supplier. So it's important to identify in that case what was the root cause of the problem, so that you can either modify your process or reach back to your supplier, and they must take corrective actions for providing you a product that was contaminated. So it's important to understand the supply chain and who to contact. Then consider your own recall history or the product's recall history. Like we mentioned earlier, there might be products that are more prone to be concerns in regard to food safety or foodborne illness. Therefore, understanding the likelihood of that product to be a potential problem can help you predetermine steps or actions to act as promptly as possible when you have to take action during a recall event. In terms of food defense, again, it requires a team and a leader, and you must also consider your product. So, am I receiving a product that is sealed and packaged? Am I working with a product that is in bulk and high volumes? Am I receiving a product that is a liquid? So, that is important in terms of determining which steps or which products will require mitigation strategies. Develop a process flow diagram. Same as with a hazard analysis, a process flow diagram is critical for the vulnerability assessment to understand what steps and how they are conducted in order to determine whether that step is a vulnerability or not. Then consider also the facility-wide measures that we discussed earlier. These facility-wide measures are general measures that typically can be applied in a facility or operation. However, sometimes these facility-wide measures can become a mitigation strategy if they can help reduce the likelihood for an attacker to access the food and contaminate the food. And then you consider your food defense history. Have you had issues in the past with an intruder getting past your security team, or you don't have a visitor log, or somebody contaminating a product or accessing a restricted area? So it's important that you consider what has been going on in your facility in the past and make sure that you have taken actions to correct those issues. So, when conducting a vulnerability assessment, we consider the type of food, also the origin of the food. Is it coming from a supplier that I've been having issues with, or is it a competitor? Or, so understanding the food and where it came from is important. Receiving, handling, and storage practices, like we mentioned, is it a bulk product? Is it something that is sealed? Is it in a bag, or is it in a sealed container? So these things can impact the accessibility to that food, and the wider scale harm that product can cause, then the more likely that it will require a mitigation strategy. Processing steps, activity types, the type of equipment used. So if you're using equipment like a tank that is open, that could be a potential vulnerability, versus using a tank that is sealed and it has a lock. So only certain persons can open that, and you are controlling who can access that product. Also, how the activities are conducted. Am I having just one employee working in this production area by themselves? Or do I have a supervisor that is working with them? Is it a buddy system where there's two or more people working in that product? So it's less prone that one employee could contaminate that product. It can be a disgruntled employee. It can be, different types of persons. Then the accessibility to the food at different steps. History of the product as well, and the supplier. Is this a product that has typically been contaminated? Is it a product like the supplier I mentioned? Do I have tension with that supplier? Would they want to harm my operation? So just understanding your business, your industry, who your supply chain contributors are, is important. Can it cause wide scale harm? That is the biggest question. Am I creating product? Am I developing product for a small, population, or in small scale, or am I doing tons and tons of product that can harm a wide range of persons? So it's important to know the scope of your operation as well. So now we will go into most common FDA observations. This information was taken from FDA's database and filtered specifically to address these plans or observations in the plans or programs. So top observations for food safety plans were missing hazards. So in the hazard analysis, there are hazards associated to the food that were missed, that were not considered and were not addressed. For the second one, no food safety plan. Some facilities just don't have a food safety plan. And like I mentioned, it's possible that it could be a very small business and they did not have a food safety plan, but they also did not submit an attestation, so they were not benefiting from exemptions. That could be a likely potential cause. Also, missing preventive controls. So, not identifying preventive controls when one was needed to control a hazard. So, sometimes we also see that where a hazard is identified, but then they say, oh no, we're controlling through GMPs. But no, that hazard, FDA says it requires a preventive control. It is likely to happen, it is severe, and you need to have a preventive measure identified. With the supply chain program, not conducting verification activities or not identifying the proper verification activities for the food received. Another observation, they did not approve suppliers. You must approve your suppliers prior to purchasing or receiving their product or using their product. And like we mentioned, if you have to evaluate their food safety history, you have to evaluate their practices and procedures to ensure that the food you're receiving is safe. And if you cannot determine that they are compliant, then you should not approve them. The FDA requires you to do that verification and evaluation to make sure that hazards that you are not controlling or that cannot be controlled at subsequent steps have been properly controlled. Then on-site audit did not review the supplier's plan. So the supplier would also be required to have a food safety plan in place. And if the on-site audit report scope does not include verifying the supplier's plan or their practices or the particular process that is relevant to your food, then it is an inadequate audit report. So it's important to keep that in mind when you are utilizing that as your verification activity. For recall plans, number one observation, no recall plan at all. So it is crucial that you identify if you have identified a preventive control, you are required to have a recall plan because that means that you are controlling a significant hazard. And in the event that your preventive control failed and you distributed that product, you need to have a plan to take action and retrieve that promptly. Second observation, did not identify the steps. So like we mentioned, a recall plan has to have all the steps and instructions. And the third one, assigning responsibilities. So in addition to identifying steps, you can have beautiful steps, but if nobody knows what they need to do at the time of a recall, you are setting yourself up for failure. The longer the product's in the market, the more harm it can cause to consumers. So having those steps and assigned responsibilities is critical. Then the HACCP plan, inadequate plan implementation. So you can have a beautiful HACCP plan, but then your employees are not executing it. The plan is not being followed. So why do you have a HACCP plan? So it's important that when you have a HACCP plan, that in addition to it being perfect, your implementation of that plan is being followed. Second observation, no hazard analysis. So we see this a lot with HACCP where there is no written hazard analysis, but there is a HACCP plan. So I guess, in those cases, the persons did the hazard analysis in their minds, got together and just thought about, well, in this process, this could be a control, this can be a control. but they did not sit down and analyze the raw materials, the particular ingredients, the process in detail to have that matrix determining I am receiving this fish. This fish is a histamine producing fish. Is this a significant hazard? Yes or no? You have to have that thought process in writing and document it to make sure that you considered all the variables, the food, the characteristics, the processing activities. How am I doing that? Uh, in that hazard analysis to then determine this is my HACCP plan based on my hazard analysis. Then missing critical control points. Similar to the preventive controls, they may have a significant hazard, and instead of assigning a CCP, a lot of people are scared of assigning a CCP. They don't want any CCPs in their process, but when there's a significant hazard, you must designate a CCP. So it's important that you have that in place with the respective components and that it's being implemented properly. Then for food defense, there's not a lot of data in terms of observations, but the main one is no food defense plan. Like this regulation is the most recent one to be enforced, and the number one observation was that there was no food defense plan at all. Um, And lastly, then, in our opinion, these are the most common Registrar Corps observations. We conduct free assessments of food safety plans and HACCP and food defense daily. And we see there are some common observations that come up over and over again, and this is our list. And they're in no particular order. But a plan does not consider all the applicable FDA food safety requirements. So, like we mentioned before, it is typical for industry to have HACCP or follow HACCP in the global sense, the general HACCP system sense, but then they won't consider seafood HACCP requirements, or they might have a product that is canned, but they're not following low acid canned food regulations as FDA requires. Or they might have let me think, they might have bottled water and they're not following, they have a food safety plan or they have a HACCP plan that, identifies all the hazards, but they are not considering bottled water requirements as the FDA delineates in the regulations. So it's important not only to have the food safety plan and follow preventive controls, is like, are there any other regulations that I need to consider and incorporate into my food safety plan to ensure I am following FDA requirements? Hazard analysis is too general and missing potential hazards. We agree with FDA on this one. That is one of the most common observations, that the hazard analysis might be too vague. It might consider a general category. So like I mentioned an example earlier, I have ice cream and then I have these hazards for ice cream, but I did not consider the hazards in the ingredients. So maybe a particular ingredient was an unapproved additive, or it was something that I just missed, then I cannot identify a hazard for something I did not even consider. So it's important to be specific in that hazard analysis, and it does take a while, but we can help you with that if needed. Preventive controls, or CCPs, are identified as prerequisite programs. I gave this example with the CCPs, that sometimes people don't want to assign a CCP and they assign it as a prerequisite program or as part of GMPs or as SOPs or something, less critical, because prerequisite programs are a foundation, just like GMPs, but they are not considered critical or preventive control measures, for food safety. So it's important that when we identify that significant hazard, we are not just identifying a prerequisite program, we are assigning a specific preventive control or CCP to address that significant concern. Finalized plans are not signed and dated by the owner or the person in charge of the facility. So the FDA requires you to have those components, but once the plan is finalized, it must be signed and dated by the owner or operator in charge of the facility. This is to demonstrate that they are aware that you have these control measures in place or that these control measures are necessary, and it shows commitment from management to food safety in the facility. So it's important that these plans are signed and dated, and that there is awareness that food safety is a priority in your facility. Then the plans were not developed by a qualified individual trained under the standardized curriculum. So the FDA does not necessarily require the training given by the FSBPCA or the HACCP Alliance. However, when the plan is insufficient, they will begin asking who made this plan and what are the qualifications? Because I see there are gaps or it is inadequate, it is insufficient. So if the person is not knowledgeable in the requirements, there will be gaps or they could be gaps, and the FDA will make note of that. And in this case, we strongly recommend the training because, like I mentioned, it's not the same thing to understand the concept of HACCP as a general globally recognized system, but understanding the requirements of preventive controls and of seafood HACCP specifically, and juice HACCP and food defense. It's important to know those requirements to be able to execute your plan effectively. Inconsistent information throughout the different documents composing the plan. So we all know that a plan may not be just one document. It might be a compilation of different documents. You can have your hazard analysis separately, and then you have your preventive control separately, and you have your supply chain program separately, and you might have other information like product descriptions and process flow diagrams. So it's a compilation, right, of different documents. So we often see inconsistent information throughout. So it's either, categories are not clear. They might have different categories, but then the process does not apply to some of the products. So the person does not know where exactly that product goes, under which food safety plan. There might be a description of the process that states that a process is manual, but then we see the process flow diagram and it's automated, or they have certain steps in the flow diagram, but then the hazard analysis does not account for all the steps. So that inconsistent information can result in missed hazards, in an inadequate plan, and it just causes confusion at your facility because there might be things you're not even aware of, that have changed, or you're reading outdated documents. And going into outdated documents, plans can be outdated because they're not being reanalyzed or reassessed per the FDA requirements. Remember, we said that the food safety plans need to be reanalyzed every 3 years, and then the HACCP plan needs to be annual. So in those cases, the you have to make sure that you're reanalyzing your plans within those time periods and whenever changes happen. We've seen plans that have been the same for 6 years, 8 years. I believe that's nearly impossible. There's always something that can change, particularly formulations and labels. And so, there's always something that can change in a facility, and having the same plan for many years is not a good indication of the person that's overseeing the operations for food safety. So it is important that those are reanalyzed and assessed as necessary. So this is the end of our presentation, and we want to present you our next webinar, which will be held on November 21st. And this will cover food safety and labeling best practices for compliant food labeling. And this is an in-depth webinar designed to provide you with an overview of the FDA food labeling requirements and also essential tips for FDA readiness. We will talk about the mandatory information that must appear on all the retail food labels, key FDA requirements, common labeling mistakes, practical tips to prevent issues, and then how labels can impact food safety. So these two topics tie in together. And did you know that two of the most common reasons for food products to be refused entry into the United States are labeling mistakes and illegal food additives? Companies don't discover that their products are permitted in the US market until it's too late, and they are detained at the port, or they can also be required to issue a recall. So any company that is selling or distributing their products in the United States must ensure that their ingredients and labeling are compliant with the FDA requirements. So in this webinar, we will cover these topics and help you feel more prepared and in regard to your labeling and how it ties to food safety. So we have reached our Q&A portion, and we want to let you know that at the end of the Q&A, we will be sending you a short 5-question survey, and we really hope that you can answer those questions, because it'll help us to give you information that is relevant and improve these webinars as time goes by, to make sure that you are fully taking advantage of that information and that you find it helpful. So please fill out that survey when we are done. I am going to look through your questions now, so if you can allow me a moment. All right, so we have here. Okay, so this is a question from Priyanka Day, and she asked, we are the importer of foods and we do not further process any food. Do we still need food safety plans, recall plans, and supply chain program? So no, if you are importer of food, you would need a foreign supplier verification program. So that is the equivalent of a supply chain program, but for importers, for US importers. And what you do need to do is make sure that your suppliers have a food safety plan, recall plan, and supply chain program of their own. So it is a different approach, but you will still need to understand the requirements and have your own qualified individual to ensure that your suppliers are following the regulations. And if you're importing seafood and juice, there's different HACCP importer requirements, but same concept, that you have to ensure that your suppliers are meeting the seafood HACCP or juice HACCP requirements. And to remind you, we are going to give you a copy of the recording of this webinar, so you will receive that as well. Mohammed Hammam asked, some auditors asked to add the shipping of incoming materials in the HACCP plan. So is this needed? So it depends. If you're talking about seafood and juice HACCP, you don't need to consider the shipping specifically. It is more of, if your hazard analysis requires you to check the temperature of that product that you're receiving for safety, then yes, you would consider that travel time. Did they keep proper temperatures during transport to ensure, in something like histamine and tuna, temperature controls are key. So if the product was caught and it took 7 hours to get to your facility, that's a significant time. So it's important that that transport was done under refrigerated temperatures. So in those cases where your hazard analysis determines that temperature requirements are essential during shipping, then you would consider that. But if it's part of, after you have processed your food, there's a shipping company delivering your product, whoever is receiving that product should ensure that the shipping company maintained temperatures, because it's already outside of your scope of control. So it's important that, throughout the supply chain, we consider those different requirements in our assessments. Mm, Let me see. Okay, so it says, as a brand, we sometimes purchase ingredients that go to our co-manufacturer for processing into the finished good. Do we need a HACCP, PCP, etc. for these ingredients, or should our co-manufacturing be collecting this information? It depends. You are not processing the food, so you are not controlling the hazards directly. But as a brand owner, sometimes there is an agreement with that co-manufacturer that they will follow your procedures. So there needs to be an agreement between both of you that you will provide them with the required controls, but also they are the manufacturer, so they have to ensure that the control measures that you have proposed are adequate, because ultimately the FDA will hold the manufacturer responsible. But you have to then come into an agreement. What are your control measures? I, as the brand owner, have an interest in that, because I don't want my product to be the cause of a recall. But also, as the manufacturer, that recall would impact them regarding FDA compliance. So you both have interest in the safety of that food and how it's processed. So you should come together to make sure that the proper controls are in place, and you both feel protected in your product is protected. Okay, let's see. Mm. Okay, in the preparation, Miriam Davila asked, in the preparation of the HACCP plan report of an EU fish processing company, is it necessary to include any reference to the FDA in its quality plan? The company is already registered with the FDA. So, yes, if you are a seafood manufacturer, processor, packer, holder, then you need to have a seafood HACCP plan in accordance to the FDA regulations. You can make reference in the documents, to the resources that you utilize to make your determinations. It is also always it is encouraged and it is required to include your thought process of why you determine a particular hazard to be significant. And being registered with FDA does not guarantee compliance. So when you register, you're only notifying FDA that your company exists and that you are sending product to the United States. So it is a notification that you are sending product to the United States, or manufacturing product intended to be consumed in the United States. So it's important that you are following HACCP requirements for fish or seafood. Okay, Danielle asks, we are a beverage company located in Canada. My understanding is that FDA and CFIA have a reciprocal agreement. I'm not clear on what the reciprocal agreement means for our program. I did complete PCQI training, for instance, but was that necessary? You can definitely use the preventive controls training. It is recommended to do that. The systems are comparable, So the main components and the majority of the agency's requirements are similar, but they're not exactly the same. So you could still have a gap in your CFIA program that you might not be aware of. So it is recommended to still be aware of the preventive controls requirements so that your plan is, applicable to both agencies and you are covered. Mm, See, I'm sorting through the questions. Thank you for your patience. Jorge Lastra asks, which of the mentioned requirements are mandatory for a food trading business? So unless you manufacture, process, pack, or hold food, these requirements would not apply to you. So if you are manufacturing and processing, you would be required to have these types of plans and programs in place. If you are simply moving product along, trading, selling, you're brand owner, you're a vendor, these plans do not apply to you because you do not have a food facility that is handling or manipulating that product. Okay, I will try to answer at least two more questions. Hmm. I see a lot of importing questions. We do have other webinars that are specific to FSBP. So I recommend that you, if you have interest in those, please contact us and we will send you the dates. But I want to focus on the food facility questions for now, for this purpose. Armin Prante asks, would frozen pre-fried French fries be considered ready-to-eat food in regards to micro safety, listeria limit not detectable, even if detailed preparation instructions and cook thoroughly are on the bag? So that is an interesting question. The FDA requires foods to not contain listeria, even if they are going to be cooked further by the consumer. This shows that the food was not properly controlled. Same with salmonella, there was insanitary conditions of some kind during processing. So the control measures for sanitation or GMPs were not sufficient. So it's important that any food that you are, even if it's not ready to eat, same applies with seafood. Seafood has been refused because of salmonella presence or other pathogenic bacteria. Even if it's going to be cooked, the FDA does not want to lay that burden on the consumer, but to make sure that manufacturers have the proper control measures in place. Let's see. I think, let me see my questions at the top. Which one is the critical difference between HACCP plans and food defense plans? So HACCP plans are targeting non-intentional hazards that are either naturally occurring in the food or that can happen during normal processing, activities. However, food defense plans then focus on the intentional adulteration. There is an attacker that is contaminating the food on purpose, either for economic gain, for damaging a company's reputation. So that is the main difference. The scope of the assessment will consider different aspects of food safety. Okay, I think that is it for the questions. So We thank you so much for joining today, and we hope to see you in our next webinar. So we will be sending a recording of this webinar as we mentioned before. And remember to please fill out that survey for us so that we can continue to give you the best content that is relevant to you. Have a great week, everybody.